To help us contemplate Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I thought I would play a traditional Japanese tune, Yashi no Mi. It means the coconut song, and it's one that would have been known by the children at that time in the 1940s. And it featured in the 1980s film called The Burmese Heart, a Japanese film about the end of the Second World War. So this is Yashi no Mi.
Thanks very much, Eddie. That was lovely. It really was. Can I now ask John Ainslie, who's the administrator of Scottish CND, to come and put the attacks on the city of Hiroshima into a historical context? This is the hardest thing to do.
In August 1945, there was troops from Britain and America that were in the troop ships sailing off towards the Far East, and they were preparing to take part in what they thought was going to be a very bloody invasion of the Japanese islands. And when the war ended very suddenly, after the atomic bombs were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, then these troops felt that their lives had been saved by the bomb. Their views were genuine, but the question is whether these foot soldiers were correct in their analysis of why the war actually ended. The newspaper headlines at the time were proclaiming that there was this new superweapon and that had forced Japan to surrender. And this version of history very quickly took hold because it was very convenient for our point of view of the United States. It provided a way of sidestepping the whole moral issue of what had happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the dreadful destruction, which as the years went by and that became a major issue, but said, well, actually it was justified because of the saving the cost of the invasion. These may have been barbarous weapons, but the media were then saying the attack was justified because by killing thousands in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they saved the lives of a far higher number of troops that would have been casualties in an invasion. The other reason it was convenient for the United States was because it had this huge, massive project, biggest ever industrial project, the Manhattan Project, to build the bomb, which had cost them $2 billion, which is a huge amount in those days. So the question of, they've done all this and some justification for it. But this theory is not only convenient for the Americans, it was also convenient for senior people in Japan, because there was this big problem that suddenly surrendered. And, well, the reason they surrendered is because there was this new scientific invention. But analysis of the circumstances surrounding the surrender gives serious grounds for disputing the traditional narrative. If we think of the latter years of the Second World War, we might think that on the one hand you've got Germany and Japan, on the other hand you've got Britain, America and Russia. But that actually is not true. Russia stayed out of the Pacific War. They had a non-aggression pact with Japan. In February 1945, Stalin, Churchill and Roosevelt met at Yalta in the Crimea. At that meeting, Stalin agreed that the Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan 3 months after Germany had surrendered. And that then meant that would have been the 8th of August 1945. This deal was kept a secret from the wider world, very much a secret. And it's very significant from the Japanese perspective. The Japanese leadership in the closing months of the war placed a lot of faith in the hope that somehow or other, they had diplomatic relations with Moscow, that somehow or other Stalin was going to mediate a way out of their position. They knew they were going to lose, but somehow or other the Soviet Union would broker some deal with the United States that would mean their capitulation was done in a way that they gained as much as possible. And then out of the blue, at 11 o'clock at night on the 8th of August, the Soviet ambassador informed the Japanese government that they were now at war. And that was a breach of the Japan-Soviet non-aggression pact. Japanese intelligence had failed to properly detect the scale of the Soviet build-up in the east. The Soviet Union had basically moved a lot of its battle-hardened troops from the west into around the Manchuria area. And they were totally ill-prepared for the devastating attack that they faced. By the time the surrender was formally signed, which was the 2nd of September, 1.5 million Soviet troops had completely routed the Japanese army in Manchuria and had captured the islands of Sakhalin and Kuril. Japan had a huge army, but their army was focused on the southern islands in Japan, preparing for an American invasion. They weren't seriously expecting that Russia would attack. Earlier in the summer of 1945, Togo, the Japanese foreign minister, had been instructed to try to extend the non-aggression deal. It already had a year to run, but they were negotiating with Moscow to extend that even further beyond 46. He was also told, we weren't all that hopeful, but he was told to try to negotiate an alliance with Russia. They were trying to get the Soviet Union on their side, and they thought that was a serious possibility. Where the reality was that months earlier, Stalin had done this deal at Yalta that he was going to enter the war and invade them. So that, the Soviet involvement totally came out of the blue from the Japanese point of view. And although they expected an American invasion, the American invasion they thought was months off. It's not going to happen tomorrow, it's going to take a long time. But the reality was they were faced with a very immediate military threat from the other side. It's not correct to say that Hiroshima was the only factor in Japan's surrender. There are two issues at play. One is the destructive US attacks, including the nuclear bombs, but the other one is Soviet intervention in the Pacific War. And it can be argued that that second factor was in fact more important. Japan had already suffered massive damage from the fire bombings. They were basically using napalm to destroy urban areas. So there had already been a change. They were bombing with conventional bombs, and then they made this change to firebombing, and then they made a step up again in terms of the nuclear weapons. 68 cities had been attacked and either destroyed or partially destroyed. 26 of those attacks took place in the 3 weeks before the atomic bombs. So if you were, the Japanese leadership were sitting, getting these reports pretty well every day, saying this city's been 50% destroyed, this one's been 70% destroyed. That's the actual climate in which they then had this other thing of saying, well, Hiroshima's been destroyed and Nagasaki's been destroyed. The first atom bomb was dropped 8 o'clock on the 6th of August, and there are no indications that that immediately brought about a sea change in thinking. They didn't immediately after that think, right, now everything's changed. The notice of Russia's intervention was delivered, as I say, 11 o'clock at night on the 8th, and it was immediately after that, on the morning of the 9th of August, that the Supreme Council of Japan met to consider details of how they would surrender. And that meeting started before the news came through of the second attack on Nagasaki. They were already thinking about surrender, and the Hiroshima attack had happened, but the Nagasaki one hadn't. I think all of this suggests that the key factor that changed was actually Stalin's military intervention. But Russia's significant in a second way, and this is an American academic in the 1960s sort of looked at this. Basically, the Manhattan Project was started to build a bomb because they thought Germany was going to build a bomb. By the end of 1944, it was clear that wasn't the case. The German program hadn't got anywhere. At this point, Joseph Rotblat, who's one of the senior scientists and who went on to play a leading role in the disarmament movement, Rotblat left the Manhattan Project at the end of 44 when it was clear its original purpose of dealing with Germany, that was no longer valid. But the project kept rumbling on. Earlier in March 1944, Rotblat was at a dinner with General Leslie Groves, who headed the Manhattan Project. And what he heard Groves say was this, that from 2 weeks after taking up the post, there was never any illusion on my part that the main purpose of the project was to subdue the Russians. The person who led the project knew from the beginning that the main purpose of it was to deal with this threat in Russia that was seen in terms of future Cold War. And in the closing years of the Second World War, that was very much the background to it, that Russia is going to be the future threat. Truman, before the first test in July 45, says, if it explodes, and I think it will, I will certainly have a hammer on these boys, meant the Russians. The chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, the bomb has to be delivered on time so that there's no necessity for concessions to the Russians. They didn't want to get involved in trying to do deals. Russia gets part of Japan, America gets part of Japan. The Secretary of War, Henry Simpson, said on the 19th of July they should use the bomb to gain political advantage over the Soviet Union in a post-war situation. And very soon after the bombs were dropped, America was drawing up plans for dropping nuclear bombs on 20 cities in the Soviet Union. Another thing that's been raised is the whole question of the role of the Emperor. On the 13th of May, the Foreign Ministry had sent a message to Moscow trying to mediate, basically saying the Emperor is desirous of peace. American intelligence was intercepting all the messages, so the American intelligence knew in May that this message was coming from the Emperor, saying that he was looking for a way out. And the Secretary of State in America at the time said that his view was that they could get Japan to surrender so long as the Emperor's position was maintained. That was the key thing to surrender, was that the Emperor stays. However, the declaration that was then made on the 26th of July, here's the conditions of surrender, made no mention of that. And it's been argued that that was particularly excluded to draw things out. Another factor is, to some extent, it was called an experiment. Both Truman and Groves talked about this experiment, and they had two designs. You've got a highly enriched uranium design, the Fat Man dropped in Hiroshima. You've got a plutonium design and Little Boy that was dropped in Nagasaki, and it was an experiment to test these two designs. Brian Quayle's been very helpful with this. Just a couple of the quotes that he's dug out. General Chennault, who was the commander of the US Air Force in China and therefore had a particular insight into what was going on, he basically said the Soviet Union's entry into the war against Japan was decisive in hastening the end of the war in the Pacific, which would have occurred even if the atomic bombs were not used. The swift blow struck at Japan by the Red Army completed the encirclement, which forced Japan to surrender. There's a whole series of military folk who've said similar things. One of them is Field Marshal Montgomery. In my view, it was unnecessary to drop the 2 atomic bombs, and I cannot think it was right to do so. The dropping of the bombs was a major political blunder and a prime example of the declining standards in the conduct of modern warfare. Just at that point, and just a slight sort of final aside to this, the nuclear bombings took place in a climate where the US Air Force were mounting daily firebomb attacks, destroying Japanese cities, similar to Dresden and what happened there. After the war, the Red Cross tried to address some of these issues of the way that war was conducted, and that resulted in a number of protocols in the Geneva Convention. Protocol 3, adopted in 1981, specifically deals with these incendiary attacks. It prohibits firebombing of civilians, but not only that, it prohibits firebombing of military targets located within a concentration of civilians. So basically, the attacks that took place on Dresden, on Tokyo, and on the other Japanese cities would be specifically outlawed today, and a clear breach of international law. So in recent years, we've seen chemical weapons banned, biological weapons, landmines, cluster bombs prohibited. And although there's a sense that nuclear weapons are illegal, ICGA said generally contrary to the rules of principle of international law, there isn't a specific ban on them. But fortunately, there is a new initiative that's moving towards that. 113 countries within the last few months have supported a pledge from Austria, which basically says to fill the legal gap for the prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons. So I think after 70 years, in this climate of what is now happening internationally, it's finally time that we ban the nuclear bomb.